Cloud, and I'm going to share. So, hello everyone, and welcome to LERA's the 74th LERA conference, section 10.6, the LERA best paper session around the union support. And today we have four excellent papers and a group of amazing presenters. So I'm going to give just a quick introduction to everyone, and we're going to kind of like proceed with those amazing presentations. So the first paper will be presented by Zachary Schaller, and he's an assistant professor of economics at Colorado State University. He's an applied microeconomist specialized in political economy, labor, and economic history. He's particularly interested in history of labor market institutions, with current research focused on unions and industrial conflict. He also enjoys applying economic models to traditional non-economic topics such as circular method in construction and strategic solutions to gun law reform, which is really hot topic. Yeah, maybe we have some time, like, we can talk about that as well. And the second presenter is Andrew Case. He's a third-year doctoral student at Florida State University. Previously, he worked in human resource and labor relations in the telecommunication industry. His current research interests include attitude towards labor unions, HR policy and practices, employee well-being and effectiveness, and the employee benefit. He's going to present a joint work with his colleague, Professor Jack Fiorito from Florida State University, and another colleague from Paris-Saclay Normal School. And the third paper is also kind of like a comparative labor research. It was supposedly presented by my co-author, Lorenzo Frangi from the University of Quebec and Montreal, but he just welcomed his new baby 2 days ago to his family. So he wasn't able to be here today with us, but I will kind of step in and fill in this big shoes. My name is Tingting Zhang. I'm an assistant professor at School of Labor and Employment Relations at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. My research interest is focused on unions as organization, particularly with attention to the organizational decision-making and the communication kind of process within the labor union. And finally, the fourth paper, we have three amazing presenters. They're gonna co-present together. And the first one is, the first one is Jacobin Apkarian. He's an assistant professor of sociology in Department of Behavior Science at York College, City University of New York. He's currently a research fellow at the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions. His current research focuses on logistics of governance in institutions of finance and higher education, as well as unionization and collective bargaining in higher education. The second presenter is Bill Herbert. He's a distinguished lecturer and executive director of National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions at Hunter College. He's also a faculty associate at the Roosevelt House Public Policy Institute and a fellow of the College of Labor and Employment Lawyers. His areas of scholars include higher education unionization and collective bargaining, labor law, and history. The third presenter, Joseph Vandernoot, is a PhD candidate in the program in sociology at the City University of New York Grad Center and a grad research fellow at the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education and the Professions. His dissertation research examines how economic forces and state-level political institutions shape the emergence of public sector unionism in the mid-century U.S. Midwest. So, it all circles back to the Midwest. And for the sake of time, and I just want to kind of mention some ground rules. We have 4 papers within 60 minutes, and I want to leave as much time possible for the discussion and the Q&A. So each presenter gonna have 10 minutes. I will kind of give you a 2 minutes reminder, and we're gonna save all the questions toward the end of the presentation. And we would not kind of like, do additional introductions in this process, but please feel free, if you have questions for each presenters, please feel free to type your questions in the chat. We're gonna come back at the end of the session to address all those questions. Okay, so, and I will pass the mic to Zachary, and the floor is yours. Please carry away.
All right, thank you very much, Tingting. Is everyone seeing the full screen share here?
Yep.
Good, okay, awesome. Well, thanks everyone, and this is some joint work with Sarah Tamaz, really a data-oriented project, kind of a big data-oriented project. We're getting into some descriptive analysis and hopefully some more substantive analysis as we pursue, but let me kind of dive into what we're doing, and then I really would covet your suggestions for the type of analysis you would like us to do moving forward. This is really at the perfect stage in the process for that. So I put this graph up. This is nothing new to this audience. We've all pretty much seen this time trend of private sector union density. Why I put it up here, though, is to suggest that there are things that it actually hides from our understanding. So we can get pretty far with this graph and with the analysis of simple union membership over time, but there's a lot of things we'd like to know that we just can't get to because the data is too aggregated. So this is a national trend per year. A lot of the data we have on unions is only disaggregated to the state and sort of broad industry level. So there could be geographic patterns that we're not seeing by national aggregates, and there could be demographic patterns that we would like to know more about. So towards that end, looking to develop a data set using high quality microdata in these NLRB certification elections. Right, and again, this audience doesn't need a lot of introduction to what those are, but that's essentially just how workers formally unionize in the United States. So there's some strengths to this data set. As I mentioned, these strengths sort of fill in the weaknesses of the traditional survey data sets that we have. So the CPS starts asking union questions in a disaggregated way in 1983. Thanks to some work by Hirsch and McPherson, we can push some of the estimates back to the late 1970s, but it doesn't really go any further back than that. And the most fine-grained we have is at the state level. So what I'm looking to do with this is to get more fine-grained to the city level, county and commuting zone as well, and focus on this flow of elections rather than just the stock of union members. And one of the advantages is that this is microdata. It's been recorded by the NLRB, which is more or less a neutral third party in this. So it doesn't have some of the weaknesses that maybe survey data might, in the sense that unions might overinflate their numbers, what they report to a survey, particularly early on in the collection period. They were suspected to be doing this. So consistent quality microdata, we have this disaggregated quite nicely. We have industry from 63 to 2011 disaggregation. Don't ask me why the NLRB stopped keeping industry records after 2011, but they're not as data obsessed as we are perhaps. So that stops then, but then we have the cities. So we have good geographical location from 63 all the way to present. I can talk about this more if people have questions with regard to voluntary recognition, but I will say that elections are still the dominant form as far as I understand, as far as evidence we can get. It's a bit hard to get data on this. Certainly elections are the dominant form of organizing prior to 1985. There's some work by Brofenbrenner that shows that. After that, it's a little less known. It seems that card check unions are becoming more prevalent, but it's hard to say. From what I can tell, the mystery is not finding out where all these new union members are coming, right? Union members are falling, elections are declining as well, but I would only be concerned if card check unions were replacing elections and then, oh, we have all these new union members, we don't know where they came from, they must be voluntary recognition. We're not seeing that. So I still think that elections are a sort of very meaningful data set. So I present this simply to convince you that, hey, no, this isn't the gold standard of union membership, right? We're not getting at the classic measure, but elections are still really useful and they're highly correlated with the stock of union members. I had a paper that just got published in the ILR review that shows that you can actually make a mapping from the election flows into the membership stocks. And I'm happy to talk about that more if anyone's interested. Okay, so the contribution to this paper is blending and merging and cleaning a lot of the data. This stuff has been around, people have been using it. We're not the first to use it, but we are some of the first to really unpack and try to consistently clean the city information and the state information here. Different researchers have done different pieces of it in geographies they're interested in, but no one's really done it for the whole entire data that's available. And it was kind of difficult to trust all of it being really consistent. For example, we had a lot of situations where the records would indicate that they were in St. Louis, Mississippi, but that's not right. And so we had to look and say, well, these things are highly subject to typographic errors, right? Missouri has a postal code of MO, Mississippi MS, you can get those easily mixed up. So there was a lot of that was going on, and then we had to clean the city stuff as well. So this effort is ongoing. We have about 95% of it done. We're still waiting to process the other 5%. But by the end of this project, we'll have gone through and manually cleaned the stuff that we could not clean by simple approximate string matching. Okay, so that's mostly our method, kind of just this fuzzy string matching, and then the stuff we don't get matched, we're doing by hand. Also, we're going to try and make everyone's life easy in this data set. We're just going to go ahead and link to some of the classic demographic variables that you can get from the Census Bureau. Okay, so our goal is to make this data set available for other people to do their analysis on, but since it's kind of a data-oriented paper, we figured we'd do some descriptive analysis ourselves. So to give you some sense of what's in here, what it looks like, some of the trends that have been happening over the last 70 years. Well, yeah, about 70. So this is just a simple, straightforward aggregation. This is just national certification elections per 100,000 workers. You can tell that it has a pretty similar and drastic downward trend, just like membership stocks do. So the correlation is high here. As I said, you can do the mapping. But since we have all this really nice disaggregation, let's break it out. If you look at major industry level, so we have 2-digit SIC code or 3-digit NAICS code that we've crosswalked. And you can tell that, of course, manufacturing has sort of the most dramatic trend here. But if you look at it, literally every industry is also experiencing decline starting in the late 1970s and picking up through the 1980s. So I have a different paper that shows this isn't just an employment shift story. We're not simply just removing a bunch of employees from manufacturing, and so therefore we're just losing targets. This is happening more within each sector than it is because of employment dropping across sectors. Similar graph here, if we break this out by major economic region, we also get the same story that unions are declining in every region of the country, not just the Great Lakes region, not just the traditionally union-heavy areas. So yes, even in the South, unions have been declining. So we unpack this a little bit and say, okay, so it's one thing to say that the number of attempts has declined, but it's another thing to say, perhaps even among the attempts that remain, they're unsuccessful. So that's another component of this. And so if we simply plot the success rate over this time, we see this really dramatic decline up until about 1982, and then this equally dramatic increase up into recent years. I won't speculate as to the reasons for this uptick. However, it is somewhat encouraging if you're a union organizer that over 60%, almost 70% of elections that are attempted are actually successful for a union. And I'm not sure, how I wasn't aware of that until I sort of broke this out. So that's actually kind of interesting. You say, okay, Zach, that's fine, but what if the 70% success rate is just a bunch of small-time unions and we're not really organizing that many workers? Well, I can use a similar graph, simply weighting by the number of eligible employees. So instead of taking sort of the average success rate in a given year, here we're doing sort of a weighted average by the size of the bargaining unit. And you can see that the trends are actually pretty similar. It's a little noisier, but we're also seeing, even in a weighted sense, pretty successful elections today. And then I'm at 2 minutes. Okay, so I'll get through this. We're actually pretty close. So we have, okay, you could so then you could look at vote share. Well, what is driving the success rate? And so if you look at vote share over time, then you can tell, okay, naturally, this is really what's driving it. At the very micro level, it is because workers are voting more for the union. And so you can see this is kind of a beautiful, but also sort of chaotically variable graph here. So this is just broken out by regions of the country. The trend is familiar to all regions, but you can see that there's quite a bit of variance across regions, especially in the last 2 decades. That's the same graph broken out by sector. Finance and construction are the most variable. This is kind of consistent with what we would expect, but we see sort of a similar trend across sectors there as well. I'll mostly skip this, other than to say that voter participation rate is really high. So 80 to 90% of eligible workers are participating in these elections. Of course, COVID really took a dive on that. It'll be interesting to see in the next few years where that bounces back to. This is the graph that I think this is really where the paper is right now. This is one of my favorite parts of it. So Sarah has done some really excellent ArcGIS work, and so this is interactive. Hopefully, it plays for you guys. But what you're seeing is just a animation, essentially, of all elections that are taking place over time. So when it starts over again, you can see that we're really populating almost the entire nation, and as this goes 5 years by 5 years, you can see really, really dramatically the decline across the United States. And what we found really interesting is that the decline, of course, is happening everywhere, but if you look closely, you'll see that it's really, elections are disappearing from rural areas, and they're becoming highly concentrated in urban centers. This may not be that much of a surprise, but it does have a huge potential for impact. Okay, so if I take the same thing basically, but focusing just on sort of the Midwest here, around Missouri, Illinois, Kansas, Nebraska, this is in 1965 and 1970, so this is pretty well populated. Of course, it's more dense in the city areas, but you still get quite a few union elections happening everywhere. If you then look at the last 5 years, oh my gosh, there's a lot of rural areas that have just completely disengaged. And this can have a huge impact, right? So there's a plenary session on Thursday that was talking about employer market power. In these small towns, you might have a lot of employer market power. And if unions are disappearing from there, you could have really, really high effects. So I think
Zachary, can you wrap up with one sentence takeaway? Okay,
so one sentence takeaway is that NLRB election data is really useful, and it's exposing geographic and demographic patterns that would be really nice to know. And then this data set will allow researchers to perform their own analysis and hopefully understand more about the union decline. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. And Andrew, can you share your screen and just go ahead?
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Keys. I am a doctoral student here at Florida State University. And I'll be talking today about a research project I've been working on with Dr. Fiorito, who's also on the call here today. We're going to be looking at support for unions in France and the US and talking about some of the differences and some of the similarities that we found. So a little bit of background here. Saw the graph earlier in Zach's presentation, but union density rates in the United States have been declining, and they've also declined quite a bit in France. It's about 11% in each of the two countries. But interestingly, although the density rates are very similar, the collective bargaining coverage rates are very, very different between these two countries. It's about 98% in France, so about 98% of French workers have their working conditions governed by collective bargaining agreement, and it's only 12% here in the US. So one of the things that these kind of two numbers show here, the density rates and the collective bargaining coverage rates, is that there are some similarities between kind of the union environment in France and the US, but there are also some big differences as evidenced by the collective bargaining coverage rate. And some of this is because of the institutional and cultural environments of these two countries. kind of despite some of these differences between the two countries, one of the things that unions have really done in both countries, though, is they have these dual roles, these two different roles that they kind of act upon. And one of those roles that we'll be talking about here today is this idea that unions try to improve the workplaces of union members, of their kind of people that they represent. And this second role that we'll also talk about here is this idea of helping all working people, so workers as citizens. So trying to reduce inequality in society, this idea of kind of the sort of justice that Flanders has talked about in his work. So talking about the first role here, this idea of workplace instrumentality. So this is really the extent to which unions are seen as responsible for obtaining favorable job conditions, what we typically think of here in the US as improving wages, hours, and working conditions. So in the US, our scholarship, our research has traditionally emphasized this idea of as kind of a determinant of support for unions here in the US, or why workers want to join unions. So we have things like workplace instrumentality is seen as a key pillar of support for unions. In some polls, as much as 50% of workers have indicated that they desire representation here in the US. And we know a lot of workers are saying that because of things, their desires that are rooted in their kind of workplace situation. So in some kind of studies have examined motivation for union support and opposition. And they typically find that unions have, US workers have this idea of worker pragmatism. They really want to see kind of this improvement in their own workplaces. And that's why they often support unions. European models for support for unions have identified kind of three different reasons for support for unions. And one of them is this idea of instrumental motives, which very much aligns with workplace instrumentality. So workers join unions because they want to improve their workplace. For France in particular, there's actually very little research that's been conducted on why workers might support unions. But Smith, back in the 1980s, conducted a little bit of research and noted that unions in France do have to deliver higher wages, better working conditions, and the like. Finally, one other thing that kind of comes to mind when we talk about workplace instrumentality is the role of unions versus what's called now the CSE in France. Previously, what was considered the works councils. And in France, the unions typically try to negotiate new agreements. So they press for better workplace conditions, while the CSE typically is more responsible for applying the existing agreement that's been negotiated. So unions in France do have this kind of role in trying to improve the workplace conditions for members. When we look at the second dual role of unions, it's this idea of pro-social unionism, which unions do when they carry out and produce and try to maintain the well-being and integrity of others, regardless of their union membership status. So this is the sort of justice idea that Flanders talks about. In the US, research has typically kind of discounted a little bit this role, more so compared to like the workplace instrumental role. But we do know that some studies have shown that when workers believe that unions are out more for their own self-promotion or their own self-interest, that they're less likely to support the union. We also know from some studies that the general public typically supports unions when they think that unions are pro-social instead of just helping their members overall. In France, workers have said that they want to join unions because of things like immigrant rights, nuclear energy, working class solidarity, which is very much kind of this idea of pro-social unionism. And French unions have historically used the idea of ideology as a way to kind of mobilize workers against government actions that might reduce employment protections for all working people. So kind of in some, these political ideological concerns are also something that's been kind of seen as a determinant of worker support for unions in France, which aligns with the pro-social view of unions. So then we kind of took a step back here and we said, how might these differences or these propensities of unions to have these different roles of workplace instrumentality versus pro-social unionism, how might they differ in these two countries? So one of the things we thought about was the culture in the US versus in France. So the US is historically seen very much as an individualistic culture, where we place a lot of emphasis on the economy and doing well in things. So we thought, well, perhaps that might increase the effect of workplace instrumentality here in the US. We also looked to the idea of the historical view of unions here in the US as workers viewing unions as an insurance policy instead of things like a social movement or a class representative. So perhaps that might make workplace instrumentality more important for US workers. Then we looked at things like the extension mechanism and employment regulations in France. So it could almost be a little bit of a substitution effect for the employment regulations in France, where workers may not view needing the union as much in France. So workplace instrumentality might be less important for workers in France than in the US. Then we took a look at, well, how might pro-social unionism be more important or less important in France and the US? And French culture, we thought, might have pro-social unionism be more important because of things like caring for others, quality of life issues, and less materialism in France than in the US. Also, this idea of union shops and agency shops not existing in France. And so up to 1/5 of French union members are either unemployed or retired, which is very different from the US. And so the motive to join the union is typically very different in France. And it's probably more due to ideological reasons than how can the union improve the workplace for me. And finally, this idea of what do unions have control over legal rights to? In the US, it's typically procedural rights over mandatory items of bargaining, where in France, unions have kind of control over much more in the negotiation process and over government regulations. So our idea here was that we think pro-social unionism and workplace instrumentality would positively influence support in both countries. But then we thought that pro-social unionism would probably be a stronger predictor in France than in the United States, and workplace instrumentality would be a stronger predictor in the US than in France. So we did Qualtrics surveys in both countries here, and we have just over 1,000 useful responses. We used an experimental vignette methodology, and we had 5 randomly generated cues. 3 of the cues we treated as control variables, and we asked participants how they might vote in a fictitious hypothetical union representation election. And what we found here was that in France, both instrumental unionism and pro-social unionism positively contributed to support for unions. There's a similar story in the US as well. So both instrumental and pro-social, these dual roles of unions positively contributed to support for unions. When we got to our moderation hypotheses, things started getting a little more interesting for us. So the first thing that we noticed was that support for unions was higher in France than in the US. But when we looked at instrumental unionism and pro-social unionism, it's non-significant. The interaction's non-significant there. So there are really no differences between the US and France in terms of instrumental unionism and pro-social unionism and support for unions. So we see that workplace instrumentality and pro-social unionism has roughly comparable effect sizes, and that worker support for unions is influenced by both of them, but the differences are not significant across each country. I know I'm running out of time here, so I'll skip to our last slide here. So talking about some future research questions, we know that the difference is different. There are differences between the two countries, but we're not quite sure why. We know it's not due to pro-social unionism or workplace instrumentality. So that's kind of a future area of support and future area of research. And so this idea that perhaps instrumentality has increased in importance in Europe. We don't know if that's true, but that's something that's been suggested by scholars. And what we found in our work is that workplace instrumentality is very important also for French workers. So I'll end there since I know I'm at time. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. This is right on time. I really appreciate it. And Zachary, can you do me a favor? Just give me a shout and when I run out of time, because like I'm very terrible at timekeeping.
Sure.
Thank you. Yeah, just let me. Okay. So my presentation is going to be super easy this time because I was follow right behind Andrew, and we actually did a similar setting, similar kind of like experimental design. The only difference that we had is like how we construct our conceptual framework and like the model that we're going to present today. So when Andrew study and talk about the difference between US and France, a lot of things significant different in terms of like the industrial relations structure and the system, and also the culture, and in terms of like, the individualism versus collectivism between like, two different continents, right? But when we look at US, Canada, like, we are neighbors, right? Like in many ways, like, we are very, very similar, but in other ways, we are super, super, super different. So, and if we want to see the difference in terms of union density, of course, like you see a big disparity. Like in Canada, we have 30% density overall, although like, private sector density has been declining up to about 12%, but still like overall compared to the US, we have a much stronger union kind of like a support. So this kind of like, disparity between US and Canada really kind of like motivate our study and try to understand what is going on, because we see a kind of like a trend in terms of like a business practices and the difficulty to organize new workplace, and all those like, union practices and representation become a much more converge over time. And in terms of a general attitude towards the union also became similar between US and Canada as well. So that really started kind of like asking our question, how do we reconcile the difference between like a strong union density and strong union coverage versus like, the kind of similar trend in terms of a union kind of like general attitude amongst, I would say, citizens. So our goal in this particular project is to understand, how do we explain the difference between personal belief and about like union affect workers' general union attitude, and also compare some situational things that we can say. Pretty much we try to answer two questions. The first is like between two countries, like, do they still have a similar general attitude, and what's the kind of individual pro-social and instrumental beliefs actually affect this general attitude. And of course, we want to tie it back to, we can't really measure like the voting parts, right? Because, if you don't vote, then we can't really measure it. But we try to measure the voting intention in terms of how the general attitude can be tied to the voting intentions. I'm going to skip the literature review and conceptual framework and just show you this part, because we have a similar starting point as Andrew's paper. Like, we really try to understand, the individual belief, how does that link to the voting intention? But we adopt a different conceptual framework, because based on Genzi's framework, we believe individual behavior is a product of individual belief and their attitude. And in this case, we see, individuals' instrumental belief and pro-social belief, and times the general kind of a union attitude leads to the things that we can't really measure, which is a voting intention. So we built this, what we call the mediation model. And of course, we also test the two kind of like, cues, the situational belief, right? If you were provided by some kind of situation, can this lead to higher voting intention as well? And we add the country as a moderator, similarly to test what's the difference. Like I said, similar research setting, similar kind of like survey questions, and this is the kind of descriptive you can see across different countries, across two countries, US, Canada, we have similar kind of pro-voting intentions. But when we look at the moderate, like, let's see the baseline model, right? Like, what we see here is, US folks are more kind of like have a positive relationship between let's put this way. Sorry. So the two individual beliefs are positively related to the general union attitude, and general union attitude positively predicts the pro-union voting attention. And also, if we put situational cues, we give them information about the positive, benefit of unions, that still leads to stronger positive union in voting intentions. And we see here the kind of like a moderating effect across country is, yes, US folks, their pro-social beliefs is actually more positive related to the general union attitude. And similar on the other side, if you have US folks are actually, if they have a positive, kind of like a more positive general union attitude, they actually have a lower kind of chance to vote for the union. So we try to understand what's going on there. Of course, there's no difference between the situational beliefs. And I want to just kind of quickly run to this part. No, this part, sorry. So we find that between US and Canada, different values actually are at the base of the general union attitude. But the general union attitude leads to different results that has different type of union voting intentions. That could potentially explain why US has like a lower success in terms of certification vote, in addition to the weak labor law protection. But what we want to highlight here is the situational cues, because look at the situational cues has not only similar effect between these two countries, but also have a very strong effect in terms of union voting intention. This ties back to what we saw recently, the union surge, right? Like, if folks see a lot of successful union drive organizing, they might get the sense or get more exposure about the positive impact of social union. So positive impact of unionization. So the situational belief probably gonna lead to more kind of success in terms of union certification. So we think that could be potentially some impact that we learn on the ground. And thank you for your time. I run out of time.
You finished early even.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
That's because Andrew did all the groundwork to explain the measures and the data set. I was lucky this time. Okay, did I stop sharing? I think I did.
Yep.
Okay, so Bill, you're gonna share the slide, right?
So thank you, Ting, and the other panelists for great presentations today. For the past 50 years, the National Center for the Study of Collective Bargaining in Higher Education Professions has collected and analyzed faculty unionization and collective bargaining data and has regularly reported on the scope of faculty union density. In 2020, we published a study demonstrating the large increase in faculty bargaining units, particularly at private nonprofit institutions. From 2013 to 2020, there were a total of 122 newly certified or recognized faculty bargaining units at public sector and private sector institutions, with over 35,000 new represented faculty. In this paper, we examined determinants and the results from 135 faculty certification elections conducted by the NLRB and public sector labor relations agencies during the period 2013 through 2020. The data was gathered by the National Center from agency filings and ballot tallies, and is a subset of a larger data set created by the National Center based on tracking each formal representation effort in higher education. Our focus today, however, is only on faculty certification elections. We've excluded data from other faculty outcomes like certifications without election, voluntary recognitions, and withdrawals before an election. In this paper, we measured two outcome variables: voter participation, the percentage of eligible voters who casted ballots, and voter margin, the percentage of votes in favor of unionization minus the percentage of votes against. We then examined how the following 5 predictor variables correlated with voter participation and vote margin. The first is faculty composition, tenure and non-tenure, full-time or part-time status. Second is unit size. Third is national affiliation of the petitioner, whether it's AFT, NEA, AUP, or SCIU. The fourth is institutional type, namely whether it's a public sector institution, private sector institution, 2-year or 4-year school. And finally, the existence of an applicable right to work statute. These variables are very much premised on prior literature regarding analyzing certification elections. So now my colleague Joseph Vandenel will now present data on participation rate and vote margins based on tenure eligibility, full-time and part-time status, union affiliation, unit size, and then Jacob Apkarian will correlate those variables with institution type and location and provide a summary of our findings. Joseph?
Thanks, Bill. So as Bill noted, I'm going to talk a little bit about voter participation and vote margin by faculty unit composition. So on this slide, what we're looking at is these data by tenure track status. So we found in our study that voter participation is highest among units of tenure track faculty, as well as units of combined status faculty, those that are both tenure and non-tenure track in the same unit. Yet we also found that average vote margins were lowest among the tenure track faculty, and yet it was highest among these combined units. Slide, please, Bill. Bill, can you hit that slide? Thanks. When we examine voter participation by full-time versus part-time versus combined full-time, part-time status, we find that full-time units have the highest levels of voter participation, followed by combined status units. And though there were smaller differences in average vote margins across the status types, we found that the combined status units actually have the highest vote margins by just a little bit. Slide, please, Bill. So disaggregating these election effort data by national affiliation, petitioning union, and by unit composition adds a little bit more context to these voter participation and vote margin figures. So as you can see here on the screen, a supermajority of these election efforts were actually among exclusively non-tenure track faculty, roughly about 81%. Election efforts were more evenly split across the different groupings by tenure status, though a relative majority of efforts were among units of exclusively part-time faculty, followed by full-time and part-time combined. So disaggregating these election efforts by national affiliation, the petitioning union, we find that fully 2/3 of all efforts in this period were affiliated with SEIU. Looking across that SEIU row, you can see that the union really mainly represented units of non-tenure track faculty, particularly those exclusively of part-time or full-time and part-time combined. So the dominance of SEIU in this period is a finding we note in the directory that Bill had highlighted earlier in the presentation. We find that the union has really helped to sort of usher in a shift in higher education unionization patterns since 2012, whereby traditionally non-education oriented unions have begun to organize academic employees. We find the SEIU has taken the lead in organizing predominantly non-tenure track faculty, especially at private and non-for-profit universities and colleges. So slide, please, Bill. So, however, if we shift to look at the average vote margins and rates of participation by affiliate, we can see that despite SEIU's dominance, the union's average voter participation rates are really the lowest among affiliates. You can see it sits at about 64.1% there. The next highest is sort of our other category at 66.9. The union's average vote margins are actually sort of the third lowest. So what we argue, though, that this is largely a product of the kinds of units that SEIU organized, predominantly non-tenure track and part-time as well as full-time, part-time combined units, which tended to have lower levels of voter participation on average. So last slide, please, Bill. There we go, great. Okay, so before handing off the presentation to Jake, I'll just note quickly that if we shift to examining efforts by unit size, we find that voter participation is highest among the smallest units, and that participation tends to decline on average as unit size increases. So these vote margins also tend to decrease as the size of the unit grows. However, the exception is very large units, which had an average vote margin higher than the prior two largest size categories. Okay, so I'm going to shift this over to Jake, who will finish off the presentation.
Sure, thank you. The picture is pretty straightforward here when we looked. So Joey just kind of talked about unit characteristics, unit level stuff. And so I'm going to kind of zoom out a little bit and start looking at institution level stuff and then geographic stuff in terms of predicting these outcome variables of participation and margin. We expected sectoral effects, but we don't really see any difference between four-year public and private colleges and universities. The participation was almost identical as well as the vote margin. We did see slightly higher participation and slightly higher margins of victory at two-year colleges, which was interesting. So it was more of the two-year, four-year divide that was driving these differences rather than sectoral thing. And if you look at it, you might think, well, this might just be down to the types again. Could be explained by the types of units being organized at these different types of institutions. The types of units that are being organized in terms of tenure track status and full-time, part-time status look much more similar among the public within the public sector than within 4 years. So that actually is not explaining the differences that we're seeing here between 2-year, 4-year, which I found interesting. The 4-year privates do look different in terms of unit composition, much more dramatically different from the public sector. Much more tenure track units, et cetera. But next slide, Bill. So then the last thing that we looked at was the right to work status of the state. So let me pull up this list here. I had it over here. What did I do with it? Okay, so we had 15 newly organized units during the period that had elections in, actually some, not all were successes, but we had 15 election efforts in Florida. We had 3 in Michigan, and then 1 each in Nevada, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And so we grouped all of those together as right to work states. So obviously with Janice, there was a change over this period in 2018. But in terms of these states, kind of having this state level and political climate that is, anti-labor, more so than the rest of the states in the sample, we wanted to see if there was differences here. In terms of participation, we didn't really find much difference, slightly higher participation in states that are not right to work. But we did see, as we expected, a pretty significant difference in terms of margin and successful election victories between these two. Bill, next slide. So basically, to wrap up, this was mostly preliminary analyses, and we're going to look at some other things. But to wrap up, we did find that full-time units tended to have higher participation. This was kind of expected. People are around campus more. The non-tenure track units were the ones that had lower participation than tenure track and combined units. Full-time and tenure track units, however, did have the lowest voting margins. And combined units had the highest margins, whether it was full-time, part-time, tenure track, non-tenure track, which we thought was interesting and not expected. To summarize the affiliation stuff, national affiliations, SEIU, as Joey pointed out, organized the vast majority of the certification elections over the period. But they did have relatively amongst the lowest participation in vote margins. And this actually, we think, is related to this conversation that Dale brought up in the chat on the side about kind of the types of elections, potentially, we don't know, but speculatively, that these different affiliations are engaging in. And it does appear, at least from this data, that SEIU might be engaging in organizing election efforts that might not be as likely to succeed. And that, as Joey pointed out, this is probably more a function of the types of units that they're trying to organize in terms of the composition. Bill, next slide. We also found that this is consistent with literature. Voter participation decreases with unit size. I mean, there's a million studies that already show this. And the vote margin generally decreases with unit size, which a lot of literature shows. But we found it to be relatively high for the largest units. And in fact, election victory was 100% amongst the 12 units in our data set that were 800 workers or more. Which is, not necessarily as consistent with a lot of the literature, but consistent with some. So we found public 2-year institutions have higher voter participation and margins than the 4 years. It really was about the 2-4 divide rather than the public-private sectoral divide. And voter participation is relatively similar in right to work and non-right to work, but the margins were significantly different. And then the next slide, Bill, and I'll finish up. Oh, back one. So the second to last slide there, just our limitations. So as I said, this is a preliminary look at this stuff. There's a lot of other factors that we plan to explore further. As Bill said, we're only looking at new certifications due to elections. We didn't look at voluntary recognitions, card checks. There were a handful of those. So there's probably around 173, I believe, efforts, and only 135 of those resulted in election. So there is a larger data set for us to explore, and we will do so. There are probably some confounding factors that can help better explain and give us a better picture of what explains these participation and margin, such as the diversity of the faculty, and then kind of the working conditions that has been talked about in earlier presentations, such as wage data, faculty-student ratios, et cetera. So these are more things that we hope to look at. We're interested in people's potential interpretations of what we found, and what other variables might be of interest. Unfortunately, we're limited in the type of analyses we can use because we're dealing with such a small sample. But so if you have ideas there as well. Thank you so much. Next slide, Bill, if you want to. Thank you slide.
Thank you, Bill, Joseph, and Jacob. And I think like in the chat, there are a couple kind of like a methodology questions for your paper. So maybe like we can start from there and then open the floor for other questions as well.
Well, in terms of methodology, we agree with Zach's position about the value of survey as opposed to relying on documentary proof. And so our 2020 directory was all based upon documents, including unit size based on the elections. And so we were able to know the size of the new faculty based not on a survey, but rather based on documents. The same thing is true with regard to the data about certification elections. The problem is that because of the nature of the split between the public and private sector, the NLRB has a much better website and it's much easier to gather data. We actually went to and got the data from each state agency that was responsible for public sector collective bargaining law, and we were able to obtain copies of tally of ballots, et cetera, like you can get from the NLRB, but we got them from the public sector. And so that allowed us to do a comparative, which I don't think there has been a paper presented that's done that where it analysis the same industry, public and private, in terms of certification elections.
And then to respond to like the statistical part of it, the majority of the findings were not significant. Some of the large differences were. So like non-tenure track having, what was it? Much lower participation, like that was statistically significant. The margins from right to work, non-right to work, that was statistically significant. But like you said, the majority were not statistically significant. I mean, my only response would be we weren't looking at trying to look at a representative sample of all elections during the period. This is the population of all elections, so it is what it is. But the standard errors are pretty large, you're right. And so, in terms of how meaningful are these findings? Really only kind of the larger ones.
I think though, if you compare the 2020 study, which shows the growth in unionization, particularly SEIU's organizing in higher ed, and then compare that to where our findings are with respect to the election results, I think it really shows a different strategic approach to handling of representational elections. I think that's something we're going to be examining further to kind of compare that, because I think those the differences in terms of the large growth of new certified units with strategic moves by SEIU to withdraw petitions, et cetera, is something that we have to spend more time studying.
Thank you. And there are a couple of discussions in the chat for Zach's paper. And Dale, you want to kind of like share your thoughts on those questions and maybe some comments as well? Or maybe Zach, like you can make some comments.
Yeah, I imagine most people read it, but so Dale was asking in part that there's this issue of targeting. So this is actually something that is kind of a common thread through all the presentations, which is fun. I put up a slide that showed, sort of success rates and those rising to higher levels, and of course that's endogenous. We don't know that that's representative of workers wanting unions or higher demand for unions. It could be, but of course unions are targeting things, right? So maybe the SEIU is targeting sort of lower probability bargaining units, Tingting's work is saying something meaningful about like the demand and like how we're driving worker demand for unions. And that's a puzzle that's, I think, fascinating to unpack. It's just a really difficult one to do. Someone brought up a Farber paper that had gotten at that in 2015. I think that's probably the closest we've had. So yeah, I don't have a real answer, but yeah, we have to be aware of the endogeneity. Yeah,
and I just want to jump into to build your paper because I work with SEIU closely, and when they had the adjunct faculty kind of organizing, it was kind of like right on top of the 5415, right? So they kind of organized the restaurant workers, the minimum wage workers, and then the adjunct faculties and the Uber driver at the same time. So at that time, the SEIU organizers, they really worked hard to organize those non-tenure track faculty. So if you I know that you have a relatively smaller sample, I would recommend you to do a qualitative study to go there, to talk to folks, because some of your findings really make sense to me, because when the SEIU organizer kind of approached the adjunct faculties, there was a mixed feeling about this. Some adjunct faculty think that, hey, this is really good. We finally have a representation, they can help us to get a better contract, right? But on the other side, some folks feel oh, why do we need to be grouped with restaurant workers, right? Folks work at McDonald's or driving Ubers. We have our professional pride. So I'm not really into this. Or if there was a representation, maybe some other union should represent us. So you're gonna see some a really interesting dynamic happen during that period. Might be able to explain some of the findings that you find, but you really got to talk to folks to be able to uncover those really interesting dynamic. And also I want to kind of add some comments both for Zach's paper and Bill, your paper. Janus really kind of changed how labor organizers to view their roles and how much effort they're going to put into the union certification organizing, right? If you talk to folks at Wisconsin right now, they're going to say, oh, every single one of our union folks are organizers because in public sector, we are no longer allowed to organizing. And then, we have to get the certification card every single year. But if you went to a different state, that they're going to say, oh, we're just going to stop doing the organizing. We need to really make sure that we protect our turf. So there are defense mechanisms. There are also offense kind of tactics that happen at the same time because of Janus. So it will be really interesting to see how those changing policies that shapes the collective bargaining relationship. And also the trend in terms of how much effort, how active, I would say how active they want to really get folks certified. Yeah.
Well, you raise a good point about Janus, because we specifically, in terms of what we presented, was only states that have statutory right to work. Obviously now in the Janus after 2018, all states in the public sector are right to work. So, but the reality was that the growth in unionization was retarded based on the pandemic. So Janus was really hard to be able to figure out what the impact is. But it's certainly going forward is certainly going to be an important element to see what happens in the public sector. Now, with regard to the SEIU work, what's really interesting is that they organize the faculty forward at private sector campuses. Which has been generally left aside after the yeshiva decision by the traditional education unions. And so there was really an open field for organizing on private sector campuses. And our 2020 study shows that the SEIU's growth was primarily on private nonprofit campuses.
Cool. I think we have about 1 minute left. Is there any pressing questions, comments, feedback?
Well, just going back to Zach's paper, we've accumulated is all the data regarding all forms of results. So we know how many card checks there were in the public sector and private sector. We know how many voluntary recognitions there were, as opposed to certs. If you're interested. in terms of
I'm interested. Where are you getting the? Where are you
based on the as I explained, we've been since 2013. We've been following every formal representation effort in higher education, and from start to finish. And so we have the data from all the different stages, including the final stage, which would include card check certification in the public sector. Some states have card check certification. There are some with voluntary recognition is involving card check. So we have all that if you wanted to touch base with us.
Probably not practical with the scale of the project that you're working on. But for us, I think it was about like 15 or between 15 and 20 out of the, compared to the 135 elections. I mean, again,
but of all sectors during this period, higher ed has been one of the few areas where there's been a very large growth in union density. And so the data may be relevant based on that for your purposes.
It's just a hard thing to get scale data on. So where we get pieces of it is worth trying to piece together. So yeah, I mean, when I was doing, I had some referees complaining at a paper I submitted. They said, well, this election stuff, you don't know how many is voluntary. And I said, yeah, but no one does. Like, I found 2 citations I could give that said something about like maybe the scale of card check, and it varied from like 13% to like 48%. And I'm not buying that 48% of new unions are card checks, but we don't know, like having any little bit. So the fact that you guys have collected that is fantastic. And yeah, I'd love to talk to you more about it.
Yeah, that's the beauty about LERA conference, right? Like folks came together and then we share data, we share our knowledge, and we share our wisdom. And that's always really, my favorite part about the conference. I saw Dale and Jack, like, you
I'd like to
turn
jump
on
in.
your camera. Do you have like any last minute?
Yes, I'd like to jump in. Zach, I think you're right in discounting the importance of non-election organizing. I faced this issue in some research 10, 15 years ago where people, maybe it was the same referee you had, who said, oh, it's election data, it's not important. Well, show me where the members are if they're not coming from elections, and they're not there. So the non-election gains through card checks and voluntary recognition is greatly overstated. It's just not happening.
A small suggestion for Zach. I actually think that tying your election results to getting a first contract is actually quite important, because it's fairly standard. Even if a union wins an election, a very significant number of those never lead to a first contract. And so in terms of effective outcomes, this would be important. Now, I don't know of any good, well, I would suspect the NLRB has that same data, because if there's a refusal, surface bargaining or whatever, that's going to lead to further unfair labor practice charges. So it seems to me that that same data set or linked data sets have a terrific possibility of taking a look at that and seeing, what is going on, how that's changing, if it is. And to some degree, I suspect that the increase in the election wins very quickly, as I said, that's probably because unions are choosing much more carefully where to use their resources in pursuing elections. But and one thing might be where they believe they can actually get a first contract. So that would be a worthwhile further step, which I think you could probably effectively link other NLRB data to see what, whether you're getting first contracts and so on. There's also what used to be OLMS, but I guess they don't at any point. I'm not sure where you could find general contract files, but I think that would really extend this work terrifically.
Okay, so
it's useful.
Yeah, go ahead. 10 seconds. You have 10 seconds.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for the suggestion. I do think that's important. I will try and see what we can do with that.
Yeah, like we run out of time for this session, but like it's a great session, great discussion, and thank you everyone for your contribution, for a wonderful, wonderful discussion. And I look forward to reading your work.
Thank you, Ting Ting.
Thank
Great
you,
job.
Tingting.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank
I will
you.
see you later.